Recognizing images is deceptively simple. We can look at an picture of a cat and easily recognize that the shapes we are seeing form a picture of a cat. However, if you were to ask the person how they are able to recognize the cats, they would have a hard time giving an answer because image recognition is so intuitive for humans. However, perception is not a trivial task. Even the best algorithms can mistake images that human babies can easily recognize. Convolutional neural networks, or CNNs, is an attempt to mimic attributes of human cognition, and it has been quite successful. CNNs are responsible for powering many vision-related tasks, such as self-driving cars, video processing, and image recognition. It turns out that CNNs are also broadly applicable to other tasks as well. First, we'll talk about how humans and other animals are able to perceive the environment, as the CNN architecture is heavily based on this. Next, we'll discuss how CNNs work, and then we'll see how CNN layers can be stacked together to form architectures. So, how do humans see images? Neurons in our visual cortex react only to a small local receptive field. In other words, certain neurons are responsible for different parts of the same image. Combined together, the neurons are able to recognize the entire image. When the light from an image passes through our eyes, it goes through the first layer of neurons that react only to simple lines and low-level details. That layer of neurons is connected to another layer of neurons that has a larger receptive field and uses the signal from the previous neuron to formulate larger shapes. And that layer is connected to another layer to formulate even higher level features. CNNs are an attempt to replicate that hierarchical structure that builds high-level features from low-level features. The first thing to discuss is a single convolutional layer. In this layer, neurons are connected to the pixels in its corresponding receptive field. That means a single neuron in the first convolutional layer is connected to some rectangular shaped region of the input image. That neuron of the second layer will be connected to the neurons in the first layer in its receptive field. We can continuously stack more and more convolutional layers. In the convolutional layer, there are two attributes that you should consider. The stride is the distance between two receptive fields. The filters, or kernels, are the weights that correspond to the receptive field. When the image is two-dimensional, the kernels are also two-dimensional. The size of the kernel is equal to the size of the receptive field. When making a forward pass, the values of the first convolutional layer is achieved by performing pointwise multiplication within the kernel and the values of the image in the receptive field. After the forward pass, the resulting 2D sheet of neurons is called a feature map. Here's an example of how the values in the first convolutional layer, which is in green, is constructed from the input image. In this case, the horizontal and vertical stride is 1, and the kernel size is 3 by 3. Note that when there are some padding going on in the image, when the receptive field reaches outside the image, we can path the image with 0 values. In addition, this picture only has one feature map. In CNNs, we usually have multiple feature maps for each convolutional layer. We would have one kernel for each feature map in the convolutional layer, and the values of the neuron in layer 2 is formed by summing up the values of the receptive field of the previous feature maps. Instead of a convolution, we could also apply a pooling layer to the input. The goal of a pooling layer is to shrink the input image to reduce complexity, memory usage, and the number of parameters, which can reduce the probability of overfitting. For example, we could take the maximum value of the receptive field to form the output sheet. Instead of taking the maximum, we could also take the average. Like the convolutional layer, you also have to define the size of the receptive field and the stride. Unlike convolutional layer, there are no weights involved. Now let's discuss how we can stack CNN layers to form architectures. As you can imagine, there are many different ways to stack convolutional layers, and there are many hyperparameters to tune. It's inefficient to try all combinations of the hyperparameters, so it's a good idea to follow some heuristics when building these architectures. Usually, CNN architectures follow the funneling pattern, where we have multiple convolution layers, then a pooling layer, then multiple convolution layer, followed by a pooling layer, and so on. As we progress through the architecture, the number of feature maps usually increase while the size of the layers decrease. Finally, we usually flatten out the final output into a one-dimensional array, and then feed that array into a feed-forward layer to do some predictions. Here's an example image of what a typical CNN architecture would look like. Over the years, there has been many modifications to the CNN architecture, but most of them are outdated except for the ResNet, also known as residual network architecture. The ResNet architecture is built by stacking many blocks, where each block looks like this image. The most notable thing about this architecture is the skip connection, where we add the values of the input to the output of the block. Skip connections allow signal to more easily flow throughout the network, which makes training easier and more efficient. We briefly discussed CNNs and the different architectures. Please try to answer some of the questions and ask questions if you're stuck.